Hi, my name is MacKenzie Gibson, and this is my presentation about social working and juvenile justice. So, to get more background about myself, I'm 16. I'm a junior in Frisco High School. I currently have two jobs, one at a water park and one at the Stoneborough Mall at Soma Intimates. And outside of school, I really like listening to music, and I like to research about my topics, specifically in jails. So, how I first started getting into juvenile justice was when I was a kid for entertainment. I really like watching videos about prisons and how prisons operate inside, and how does being confined to a cell really affect a prisoner's mental health. And so that constantly led me into like a rabbit hole of looking at adults, elders in prison, and adolescents in prison as well, and how the systems are different for each age group. And last year, when I officially decided I wanted to study juvenile justice, was when I was in sophomore year in my computer science class, because I always thought that I wanted to be an entrepreneur in app development, making my own app and programming it myself or hiring people to program it with me. But I started to realize that computer science isn't my specialty, because as a person with dyslexia, it's really hard to not have someone be more hands-on with you and learning as you grow with you to guide you, instead of just teaching you on a screen and then letting you figure it out by yourself. And so I knew that I wanted a job that fits my hobbies, fits my interests, and allows me to not have to look at a computer screen for more than 2 hours, and allows me to get up and move freely as I please. And so that's how I decided that I wanted to do juvenile justice, because since I love prisons, I knew I want to work inside a prison. And what more better way to do that than to working with juveniles, because those are the future generations. And since most people who start to become more prominent criminals or criminals as a career, they start young because of their environment, because some people don't live in environments that are safe like Frisco. There's people who live in gang prominent areas, or people with family issues that cause them to commit such crimes. An example of this is there is some sexual abusers that are either put on death row or in prison. They were sexually abused as a kid, and that behavior led them to become a sexual abuser and as they grew up. So a quote that I picked out was, juvenile crime is not naturally born in the boy, but is largely due to either spirit of that is in him, his own stupidity, or to his lack of discipline according to the nature of the individual, by Robert Baden-Powell. This quote connects to me because I always believed that juveniles are naturally born evil, because it's psychologically impossible, because you have to learn behaviors to become who you are. Like, you have to learn to become a sexual abuser because of how people treated you in the past, and you have to learn to become a murderer because you have to learn those patterns to become those things. Like, for example, there is Jeffrey Dahmer. He started as a young age because of how he was sexually abused, mentally abused, and he tested on smaller animals. So those behaviors led him to become who he was in the modern day. So for my original work, I knew that I wanted to create a product that will help juveniles express their feelings and express who they are and why they committed the crime, to help their social workers. So I wanted to create a product that was easy for them to connect with, and it was kind of lighthearted, so where they didn't feel that mental pressure on their chest where they have to explain everything in one moment, then having to not ease their pain and easily tell them by separating it and putting it into smaller pieces, where you can talk about your feelings at one point, but then you take a break and do something else that separates emotional pain and just joy in general. So the information that I gathered from my original work was my specific field of social working. So there are different levels, like meso and micro. Those are more legislative social working levels, which you get to work with the government and create policies and rules that can help children with either disabilities or with abuse or family issues. And then there are clinical social workers, which I interviewed a lot in this original work process, and they mainly work in healthcare because they help diagnose their patients. And I learned that I didn't really want to do that at all because after interviewing some people from Baylor Scott White, I didn't find myself working in a hospital because the pathway to become a clinical social worker was kind of similar to just medical school, and I wasn't interested in going the medical pathway. So I knew that I wanted to become a forensic social worker, which is also known as a criminal social worker, because those specifically work with criminals in the criminal system. So I'll get to help advocate, get to be by their side more closely because as sort of I assume I thought I wanted to be a correctional officer. And so as correctional officers you don't get to advocate like social workers do. You basically have to follow a strict guidelines and a strict plan of what you have to do in order to provide or take care of those inmates or juveniles inside the correctional facility. And that basically is just you monitor them, you transport them or do booking process and stuff. And that didn't necessarily excite me either because my main goal was to advocate for juvenile justice and advocate and make a change to correctional systems. So I started to plan how to become a forensic social worker. The next thing that I learned from my original work was job location. So for social working, it's kind of a niche job where it isn't too popular in Texas because when I was looking for specifically for forensic social workers in Texas to interview, there were only a couple that I saw that were in like Tyler or San Antonio, Texas. And so I knew that I would have to branch out my location to be able to find a job. So I looked up which job locations were the best for this job career, and I found that in New York, California, and the Columbia District in Washington was the best, were the three highest paying areas for forensic social working. So I know that if I want to pursue my studies at Texas State and go down the military and correctional pathway, I will need to save money and plan to relocate outside of Texas. Or I also learned methods. These methods that I learned in my original work that I also included into my original work was social working methods. These are like the basic general social working methods that a lot of social workers use. These come from methods that can help them connect to their clients, and how can their clients demonstrate what they're going through, and how can social workers help them, which I'll go into more detail about later in this presentation. The last thing I learned was different levels of social working. Like I mentioned, there are meso, macro, clinical. Those social working levels take more time or different educational pathways that are that need to be considered because you may need to go down a medical pathway or more of a law pathway, or maybe just a basic social working pathway in general. Or like me, I'm going to take minors in criminal classes so I can still get my social working pathway, but also get the criminal aspect of what I want to do as a first social worker. And that also influenced my salary because different levels influence different salaries because the highest level was meso and macro, and those are the highest paying jobs as a social worker. So for my main idea about my original work was how can juveniles express their feelings easily? As a adolescent myself, I know it's really hard for me to explain to my parents how I feel and why I may do the certain things I do. And so, an easier way that I found in myself that I tried to incorporate to my original work was journaling. And so, this my interactive book that I created as my original work. This is kind of like a small journaling task that social workers can have their clients do, which has to write all their problems that relates to what their crime is, because there is a guideline where you can't necessarily, well, as a student myself, I can't necessarily ask certain questions because it goes against their privacy. So these are more what social workers can ask themselves. So what my original work was going to take is going to help me in the long run is how I'm going to use these techniques and these questions into my social working techniques. And so I created a way that juveniles can state their mental background and their mental process of committing the crime and their mental process of what they're going through after committing the crime. So the social working tips that I included and that I learned For my assessment 10 were culturegrams. Culturegrams are to show one's culture and the breakdown of how certain cultures may include certain mental issues. Like I know for African Americans, there is a higher idea that we all have divorced parents, and divorced parents can cause depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues. That and you can see that through the culturegram. Or if someone was Hispanic and Hispanic may have certain type of mental health issues in their culture, you can see that through the rundown of their culturegram. And for econ maps are to show one's connection with somebody. So if I had a bad connection with my mom and a good connection with my dad, my social work is able to see that through the lines that I draw to show how I connect with these people. And for personal SWOT analysis, these are basically to show the client's weaknesses, strengths, vulnerabilities, and opportunities. And a client can write this down, and that goes with their environment by saying, in Frisco, I have certain educational opportunities and certain job opportunities, but I'm vulnerable to certain jobs because I lack the certain skills that I need. Or I'm weak in these certain areas, or I'm weak in these certain social skills that I need to be able to have to open up my opportunities more. For self-assessment templates, those are a deeper dive of to SWOT analysis, but it goes deeper into one's family history, like medical history, outside school activities, and their hobbies. And for genograms are to show their genealogy of that client. And so if my uncle had depression and my dad later had depression and then I had depression, my social worker can see the rundown of how a common trait in my family that carries this depression trait. And for sociograms are to show their connection within your friend groups. And so I specifically like to connect this to gangs because there's so many people in gangs and with certain type of power or influence. And so social workers can see if that client decides to open up about it, how this person may have this bad relationship with this person in the gang, but this good relationship with this other person in their gang, and they can see how both influence their behaviors. And this can connect to peer pressure because peer pressure is one of the biggest things that may influence juveniles to commit certain crimes because the people that they surround themselves with pressure them to do certain things just to fit in because with someone with a bad family history they may not have the right people or enough people to talk to or connect with, so they will try to do anything to connect themselves or fit themselves in a group to make them feel like home or at least to just give them someone to talk to. But this can also have negative effects because it causes them to do things that go against their morals or their values. And for mind maps are for social workers to use only. Social workers use mind maps to show everything that their client has said into a well organized and broadened map to show all the connections that they said that can lead to other things. Like if a social worker wants to connect how this client has depression from their dad's side, they can connect that and then show how their client has thoughts of self harm. For my requirements for my original work, I needed my assessment 10 to design the book and because I wanted to design it in a cartoonish way to where it's kind of like a basic kids interactive book like I grew up with, but still have that impactful meaning to it. And I needed to create the questions and small activities. So I added crossword puzzles and just basic fun puzzles to get them engaged and sidetracked from the pressure of talking about themselves. And I also proof checked it. During the mental process of creating my original work, I knew that of course it's hard to say how you feel, but it's also kind of hard to talk about yourself because I know that I struggle with that as well. And so I specifically make questions to where they don't necessarily have to talk about them and their backstory, but they need to talk about things that get them help. Because as a social worker, you have to advocate and actually help that client. And you have to help their family and give their family answers to why may their child have committed that crime. And this could mean that if their client has substance abuse and they write that down, then the social worker has to give them a program to where they can help with their substance abuse and help get the treatment that they need. Or if their client has some type of mental health disability that they've been having for a long period of time without any treatment, their social worker is required to help them find the treatment that they need, or ask or suggest the treatment that they need. And this could also mean that testifying against on their behalf to the court, because as for the social worker, that's another thing that you have to do is to testify against them. And so you can show the progress of their client and how they have changed to become a better person, or they may have changed to become worse than they already started. Because I know that inside correctional facilities, they don't actually do much help. Instead, they do a lot more damage to a juvenile's mental health because they're confined into a small cubicle, into a small cell for hours at a time, and they don't necessarily get the proper nutrition or the proper mental health due to lack of resources, or they don't get enough treatment because, or they don't get the specific treatment that they need because of abuse that's going within in this facility, that the correctional officers and the staff members choose to hide themselves without actually advocating or telling their parents or their guardians that their child has been sexually abused and they haven't been having any treatment lately. So for things that I learned two main things that I learned from my original work process in my ISIM path career. I learned how I can easily connect an efficient way to my future clients. I learned that the social working methods are beneficial and how I can connect that and interpret it into my own way to how I can ask questions in in my way. Then asking the generic questions like how do you feel, what did you do, why did you do this? I can switch it up into how can I connect with my clients better, because one of the main things that I like to do is I like connecting with people, especially at work. So I can take these tips into how can I have my client trust me more, because in social working the biggest thing is trust. Without trust you can't get far anywhere, because if your client doesn't trust you they won't open up to you or tell you anything to where you can't help them at all. And the other thing that I learned was from my research showcase was explaining things. I thought that in my original work, especially, that I would have a hard time explaining every assessment that I've completed and how can I compile all that information into a single sentence or just in a small conversation. And I learned that I actually can do really well, especially because I can remember every I can't necessarily remember word for word, but I have a general idea to where how I can persuade my message and convey what I'm trying to tell in my words. For my real world purpose, it was to create an option for social workers can actually use. And so as a inspired social worker, I think that one of the methods that I want to use is journaling, because journaling has helped me better write how I feel and better interpret all the hidden messages that I put into my writing. And so I will not only use the specific social working tips that I gathered from my research, but also inquiring some of the methods that helped me in the past to better connect and help my clients. For my mentorship, at first I didn't have a mentor, especially for the first semester and going to the second semester, because no one either called me back or they were interested in becoming my mentor at all because of their work ability, especially because for the social working, they all had a specific time of closing and opening their business that didn't fit my school hours. And so I decided to just have a common interviews, and one of the main person I interviewed was Jeremy Jones. He works at the Collin County Juvenile Detention Center, and I learned that in his facility that they're inquiring more technology into their facility, which he didn't go into a broadened idea of what specifically he means by that, but I like to interpret that is that this may mean that there may be having some virtual therapists or virtual ways for juveniles to better communicate with their families since there is a time that that families have to get their visiting hours basically, and that isn't enough time for juveniles, especially in the growing process of being rehabilitation. And so this may mean that they may have Zoom or just another easy way for juveniles to virtually connect with their families. But I did at the end level it down to my two psychology teachers since I have a dual credit psychology teacher and an on level psychology teacher. And so I asked my high school psychology teacher, Coach Coach Guerrero, and he did accept being my mentor. And so we've been working together into my final product and how can we separate my information and how can we build my final product. And because he did agree on my original work since he wasn't there to actually help me build it, but he did agree with it, and I thought that he would be a good fit to be my mentor because he does know a lot about psychology, and psychology is one of the biggest things that needs to be thought of when rehabilitating juveniles because you have to look into their mental aspect, their mental health, and and how they are psychologically and biologically. Like there is like their cortex, one of their cortexes isn't officially developed yet, which affects decision making, and that's what psychology also focuses on. And so going forward for my final product, as an since I know that I want to be a forensic social worker and I started my research into studying forensic social working and social working methods, I learned that there isn't a lot of information about this specific field because of how niche it is, and the information starts to get really repetitive. And so I want to create a pamphlet for people that are interested in my field because during my research showcase there was a girl that I talked to. She was interested in my same career pathway, and she was really interested in learning more about my process of learning of all the information that I gathered on leading up to my first social working process. And so I want to be able to create a way to show the actual realistic day-to-day life as a first social worker other than watching people's point of views from their experience as a first social worker on YouTube or other online platforms. So I thought of including a case study which social workers use on their clients. I included what it's like to be a woman versus social working because the women are dominating in social working fields. So I did put in some notable women who have been in the first social working field and the statistics of women in public services like law enforcement, cybersecurity, and I included the actual day-to-day life in the educational process of becoming a forensic social worker because there is pathways that you can choose to go on. You can take more minors. Like I know at Sam Houston, there is a victim advocacy program that you can take online, which is a good idea to take as such as fun fun class to take since your goal is advocating for victims. And I really just wanted to add in, especially the racist portion of it because I know as a black female there isn't a lot of information regarding that too. So I wanted to show people what it's like to be a female, especially a woman of color in this field. And I have done that by separating some key information into my assessment 13, assessment 14, and assessment 15 by breaking down the important information into what I want to put into my pamphlet because I don't want it to be so long that I disengage my audience or my readers because I know numbers can be really boring, especially a lot of words. And so I started to separate the actual important things besides the case study because the case study is kind of all one important information because it's one big example of what you will actually have to write as a social worker. And I started to design what I actually want my pamphlet to look like for my final product. And that's all. Thank you.
Anybody have questions?